Welcome, dear listeners. Draw your chair a little nearer to the fire and pour a fresh cup, for the vicarage tea has just been laid, and the roses of St. Mary Mead are blooming with an almost indecent brightness this June. But do not let their sweetness deceive you. Ask yourself, before you turn the page, what happens when a village discovers that the man they mourn was never the man they knew, and that the truest lie was told, night after night, by the person they trusted most? The village built on a lie, a Miss Marple mystery. Section 1. The Roses of St. Mary Mead. June had arrived in St. Mary Mead with the punctuality of a well-bred guest. The hawthorn hedges frothed with white. The vicarage lawn, mown that very morning by young Ted Barlow, smelled of cut grass and the faint, virtuous damp of the previous night's dew. On the low stone wall outside Danemead, Miss Jane Marple's cottage, a tabby cat sat with the patient dignity of a church warden, watching a bumblebee negotiate the honeysuckle. All was, to the casual eye, exactly as it had always been. Miss Marple herself, in a lavender cardigan and her second-best straw hat, was engaged in the delicate operation of tying up a wayward Gloire de Dijon. She had known that rose for 30 years. It had opinions. It required, she often said, the same firm gentleness one applied to a nervous curate. She was smiling faintly at the thought when Mrs. Price Ridley came up the lane at a pace which, in that lady, always signified either indignation or intelligence. "Miss Marple," said Mrs. Price Ridley, before she had quite reached the gate. "Have you heard? Colonel Prothero, Colonel Fenwick, dear me, I hardly know how to say it, he is dead." Miss Marple lowered her secateurs. She said, with the mildness which those who knew her had learnt to distrust, "Which one, dear?" Mrs. Price Ridley, who had come with the intention of delivering the news like a well-timed cannonade, was momentarily disarmed. "Colonel Ambrose Fenwick," she said, recovering, "of Marchbanks, found this morning at the foot of the terrace steps. Cook thought he had had a stroke. Dr. Haydock thinks otherwise." "Dr. Haydock," said Miss Marple gently, "so seldom thinks otherwise without reason." The bumblebee, disturbed at last, lifted from the honeysuckle and blundered away over the wall. Miss Marple watched it go with an expression that a stranger might have called wistful. It was the expression she wore, in fact, whenever the fabric of the village received its first, almost invisible tear. By the time Mrs. Price Ridley had trotted off to acquaint the vicar's wife with the news, the tabby cat had also gone. St. Mary Mead, on the outside, remained as it had been at breakfast. The smell of new bread from Mrs. Weatherby's kitchen, the tap of the blacksmith's hammer, the far-off bell of the church clock striking the half-hour, with the confidence of a village that believed itself blameless. Yet Miss Marple, retrieving her secateurs, felt the small, cold pulse she had felt many times before, the pulse of a place which does not yet know that it has begun to lie to itself. Marchbanks stood at the top of the village, behind a screen of copper beeches. Colonel Fenwick had bought it 7 years ago, upon retirement from what he called the service, and what nobody in St. Mary Mead had ever pressed him to define. He was a widower, courteous, punctual at church, generous at the fête, and possessed of a curious knack for making even the most curious questions seem, upon reflection, impertinent. He was much liked. He was, in the phrase of the village, a thoroughly decent man. His housekeeper, Mrs. Gudgeon, had found him at 6:30. He was lying on the flagstones at the foot of the terrace steps, his dressing-gown belted neatly, his slippers still upon his feet, one hand curled as though it had, at the last, been reaching for something. There was a small dark stain beneath his temple, where the stone had met bone. On the terrace above, the French windows of his study stood open onto the morning, and a single glass, brandy, Mrs. Gudgeon said, and only a taste taken, stood on the little table beside his reading chair. By 10 o'clock, Inspector Slack, whose Christian name was Cyril and whose temper matched neither, had arrived from Much Benham. By 11, Dr. Haydock had confirmed that the colonel had died between 10:30 and midnight of the previous night, that the injury to the temple was consistent with the fall, and that, here his eyebrows rose in the manner Miss Marple had known since her girlhood, the colonel's dressing-gown pocket contained a torn scrap of paper on which, in a hand not the Colonel's, someone had written the single word, "Remember." It was Griselda Clement, the vicar's young wife, who told Miss Marple this last detail over an entirely unnecessary second cup of tea in the vicarage drawing-room at noon. Griselda told it with the shining eyes of a woman who has, at last, been given something worth telling. "Remember," she repeated, "just that. Isn't it thrilling and horrid?" "It is," said Miss Marple. "A very old-fashioned word." "Old-fashioned? One does not, my dear, write 'remember' on a scrap of paper to a man one has known a fortnight. One writes it to a man one has known a very long time. And one writes it, as a rule, when one is quite sure he has been trying not to." Griselda considered this. Then she said in a lower voice, "There is something else. Mrs. Gudgeon says the Colonel had a visitor last night. She heard the study bell rung at 10:15. She was in her bed with the door ajar. She always sleeps with the door ajar since her sister's stroke. And she heard a woman's voice." "A woman's voice," repeated Miss Marple. "Low, quite low, but, and this is what Mrs. Gudgeon particularly says, a voice she did not know." Miss Marple set down her cup. Outside the vicarage window, the roses on the south wall, Madame Alfred Carrière, planted by the last vicar's wife in 1919, moved very slightly in the June air. It struck her, not for the first time, that roses were an admirable emblem for a village. They bloomed in ranks, they smelt sweet, and their thorns were tucked beneath the leaves where nobody who did not know to look would ever find them. "A voice she did not know," said Miss Marple thoughtfully. "In a village, dear Griselda, that is really the most remarkable thing anyone has said to me this morning. In St. Mary Mead one knows every voice, the voices one likes, the voices one dislikes, and the voices one has spent 30 years pretending not to recognise. To have a voice at Marchbanks at 10:15 at night which nobody knows—" She did not finish. She did not need to. Griselda, watching her, saw a small line settle between the elderly lady's brows, and felt, as she always felt in such moments, that the pleasant June morning had cooled by several degrees. On her walk home, Miss Marple paused at the lich gate of St. Mary's. Someone had left a bunch of white roses upon the step, tied with a strip of black ribbon, and no card. The roses were fresh, the ribbon was old, frayed at one edge, as though it had been kept a long time in a drawer. She looked at them for a moment. Then she looked up the lane toward Marchbanks, where the copper beeches whispered in the light wind, and murmured, to nobody in particular, "So it has begun, after all." The tabby cat returned to the wall of Danemead at 12:30, and found Miss Marple standing quite still in her front garden, the secateurs forgotten in her hand, gazing at the Gloire de Dijon as though the rose were a witness whose evidence had not yet been given. The village clock struck the quarter. Somewhere behind the church, a wood pigeon called twice and was answered. Section 2. What the Village Said. The wood pigeon was still calling when Miss Marple, having laid down her secateurs at last, unpinned her second-best straw hat and put on her best. It was Tuesday. On Tuesdays she took her small marketing basket to the post office, thence to Mrs. Weatherby's for a quarter of coffee, and thence, if the morning demanded it, and this one plainly did, to the vicarage garden gate, from which vantage the whole of St. Mary Mead conducted, without knowing it, its Parliament. The Parliament had already convened. It sat, this Tuesday, upon 3 benches, the wooden one outside the post office, Mrs. Hartnell presiding, the green one by the War Memorial, Miss Weatherby in the chair, and the stone bench at the vicarage gate itself, where Griselda's small terrier acted as sergeant-at-arms. Between these 3 seats, a current of information passed with the rapidity of well-laid gossip and the piety of the recently bereaved. "A stroke," said Mrs. Hartnell firmly, to a young woman from Old Hall who had unwisely paused to buy stamps. "Cook said so at 7, and Cook has been at Marchbanks longer than any of us." "But the paper," said the young woman. "They say there was a paper." "There is always a paper," said Mrs. Hartnell, in the tone of one who had lived through 2 wars, several scandals, and one really quite regrettable vicar. "It signifies nothing." At the War Memorial, however, Miss Weatherby had reached an entirely different verdict. "Debt," she said. Colonel Fenwick had debts. My brother's cousin at the bank in Much Benham let it be understood, you understand, my dear, that he did not say, but he let it be understood that the Colonel had, only last month, made certain arrangements. Arrangements, said her audience respectfully. Arrangements, said Miss Weatherby, and closed her mouth like a purse. By the time Miss Marple reached the vicarage gate, the two theories, apoplexy and embarrassment, had been joined by a third, promulgated by Mr. Petherick, the solicitor, on his morning walk. Mr. Petherick, being a solicitor, believed nothing until it was written down, but he had allowed himself to observe, in passing, that Colonel Fenwick had, some weeks before, come to see him about a codicil. A codicil, in St. Mary Mead, was an object of very grave interest. It suggested foresight, and foresight, in a healthy man of 62, suggested, as Miss Weatherby immediately pointed out, a mind that had, quite recently, begun to be afraid. Miss Marple listened to all three theories with the courteous attention she gave to every hypothesis, and believed none of them. She was thinking instead of the white roses at the Lich Gate. She had gone back for a second look on her way to the post office, and had discovered, as she had half expected, that they were gone. Griselda came out of the vicarage in a hat that would, in London, have caused comment, and in St. Mary Mead did. "Jane," she said, tucking her arm through Miss Marple's, "I have been thinking about your voice." "My voice, dear?" "The voice Mrs. Gudgeon didn't know. I have made a list." Griselda, whose enthusiasms were as sincere as they were sudden, produced from her pocket a small square of paper. "It cannot be Mrs. Hartnell. It cannot be Miss Weatherby. It cannot be Mrs. Price Ridley. Mrs. Gudgeon would know her voice through a stone wall. Nor cook, nor any of the maids, nor the doctor's housekeeper, nor, said Miss Marple gently, any woman Mrs. Gudgeon has ever heard before." "Exactly, which means, dear, that either the visitor was a stranger, or she was somebody Mrs. Gudgeon has heard so seldom and at such distance that her voice has not fixed itself in memory. Both are interesting. In a village, one or the other is nearly always the case." Griselda considered the distinction, and having considered it, made a face. "You mean somebody who lives here, but whom Mrs. Gudgeon almost never meets? That does not sound like anyone in St. Mary Mead." "It sounds," said Miss Marple, "like several people in St. Mary Mead, if one thinks about them, but we shall not think about them yet." They walked on. At the corner of Old Pasture Lane, they met Mr. Denning, the Colonel's nephew, on his way from Marchbanks to the Blue Boar. Mr. Denning was a slight, fair young man of perhaps 28, with the sort of nervous handsomeness that in Miss Marple's experience often concealed either a stammer or a temper. He had come down from town 2 days before, and his black tie sat upon him with the uneasy correctness of a garment recently bought. "Miss Marple," he said, lifting his hat. His eyes were red, but not, she thought, from weeping, from sleeplessness rather, and from something else which she could not yet name. "My dear boy," she said, "I am so very sorry." "Thank you. It is a great shock." He paused. He wanted, she saw, to say something else, and did not quite know how. "Miss Marple, you knew my uncle a little. Did he ever speak to you of the past?" "He spoke to me," said Miss Marple, considering, "of his garden, of the Church Restoration Fund, and, on one occasion, of a hunt he had ridden with in 1928. He did not, otherwise, speak of the past." "No," said Denning. "No, he would not." He seemed about to say more, then a shadow fell across the lane, and he looked up sharply. The shadow was Mrs. Lestrange. She had passed the corner without any of them having heard her. She moved, as she always did, with the noiselessness of a woman accustomed to rooms she was not sure she was welcome in. She wore grey, a soft, expensive grey, and a hat with a veil that fell to her chin. She was perhaps 50. She was, everyone in St. Mary Mead agreed, extraordinarily handsome. And in the 18 months she had lived in Little Gables she had, so far as anyone could ascertain, spoken to no one except the vicar, the doctor, and the boy who delivered her groceries. She inclined her head very slightly to Miss Marple. To Mr. Denning she did not look at all. She passed on, and the perfume she left behind her, violets, and something drier and older beneath the violets, hung a moment in the June air before it too went away. Denning had gone quite pale. "Excuse me," he said. He touched his hat again and walked off, more quickly than politeness required, toward the Blue Boar. Griselda stared after Mrs. Lestrange until she had turned the corner. "Jane," she whispered, "did you see his face?" "I saw," said Miss Marple, "a very great deal of faces this morning, dear. I shall need a little while to sort them." She went home by way of the churchyard. Someone had left a fresh bunch of white roses upon the lych gate step. The strip of black ribbon this time was new, but tied about the ribbon, quite deliberately, was a length of old, frayed silk, the same silk, she thought, as had bound the first, as though someone were replacing what had been taken away, and yet leaving, each time, a small, deliberate piece of the older grief behind. Miss Marple stood a long time at the lych gate. The wood pigeon called again. Behind her, in the village, the Parliament had adjourned for luncheon. The theories of apoplexy, debt and codicil were being carried into every kitchen and dining room like dishes at a servant's ball. She heard none of it. She was listening instead to what nobody in St. Mary Mead had yet said aloud. That evening, at 6:30, Inspector Slack came to Danemead. He came, he said, because Colonel Melchett had suggested it. He came, his manner said, because Colonel Melchett had insisted upon it. And he came, his eyes said, in the settled conviction that old ladies who kept canaries and grew roses had nothing whatever to contribute to the investigation of a serious crime. He was received with tea, seed cake, and a courtesy that he was too tired to notice was slightly amused. "There will be an inquest, of course," he said, when the seed cake had gone. "Thursday. Meanwhile, madam, I understand you were in the village all yesterday evening." "I was, Inspector. I went to bed at 10. "You heard nothing? Saw nothing?" "I saw," said Miss Marple, "a light in Little Gables at 11:15. That is unusual. Mrs. Lestrange, as a rule, is in darkness by 10. Inspector Slack, who had not been going to ask about Little Gables at all, wrote it down. "And," said Miss Marple, pouring him a second cup, "if I might be so bold as to suggest, I should be very interested to know whether Colonel Fenwick's brandy glass had been wiped." Section 3. The Brandy Glass. Inspector Slack, who had come to Danemead in the settled conviction that seed cake was the beginning and end of Miss Marple's contribution to police work, went away at 7 with the brandy glass in the front of his mind and a small, incoherent irritation at the back of it. It was the irritation, he would have said, of a busy man interrupted. It was, in reality, the irritation of a busy man who has just been shown, very civilly, a door he had not known was there. He drove up the hill to Marchbanks with his sergeant, Hurst, silent beside him. The copper beeches, in the last light, had turned the colour of tarnished bronze. Mrs. Gudgeon, red-eyed but composed, admitted them. "The glass, Mrs. Gudgeon," said Slack. "The brandy glass in the study. Where is it now?" "On the tray in the pantry, sir. I washed it this morning." Slack shut his eyes. Hurst, who had been a policeman long enough to know when to look at the carpet, looked at the carpet. "You washed it," said Slack. "With the breakfast things, sir. It didn't seem right, the Colonel gone, and his glass standing there." Mrs. Gudgeon's voice failed her. She was a decent woman, and she had loved the Colonel in the manner of decent housekeepers, which is to say, without ever having examined the fact. She now examined it briefly and put it away. "Never mind, Mrs. Gudgeon," said Slack, in a voice that quite plainly minded very much. "Now, this voice you heard, at 10:15, a woman's voice, low. Low, sir, and cold, I should say. Not angry, colder than angry." "Did the Colonel raise his voice?" "Not once, sir. He was very quiet, but not, if you take my meaning, in the way he was quiet with the vicar or Dr. Haydock. He was quiet in the way a man is quiet who has been struck." Slack wrote this down. "And when did you hear the visitor leave?" "I did not hear her leave, sir. That is what I have been trying to tell everyone. I heard the study bell at 10:15, and I heard the murmuring. I could not make out words, only the tone, for perhaps 20 minutes. Then it stopped. And then, at 11:30 or thereabouts, I heard the front door. You heard the front door open? I heard it shut, sir. Only shut. Very quietly. Slack considered this for a moment. Then he asked, almost as an afterthought, "Was the front door locked when you came down at 6:30?" Mrs. Gudgeon hesitated. "It was on the latch, sir, not locked. The Colonel always locked it himself, last thing." They went out onto the terrace. The flagstones had been washed, but Slack, kneeling, could see the faint pale outline where the stain had been. He could see, too, the marks of the Colonel's slippers on the top step, one clear, one smudged, and, some distance from them, at the corner of the terrace wall, a small crescent-shaped scuff, as though the heel of a woman's shoe had pivoted there in some haste. It was not a print. It was only a scuff. Any policeman in England would have overlooked it. Slack, who was less able than he was diligent, overlooked it too. Sergeant Hurst, who was more observant than his rank suggested, saw it and said nothing, because Slack had already turned back to the study. In the study the lamp still burned. On the little table, where the brandy glass had stood, there was now only the ring of moisture it had left upon the polished wood. Beside the ring, a book lay open, face down, in the way the Colonel had disapproved of all his life. It was a slim volume, bound in dark green. Slack turned it over. The Poems of Sir Henry Newbolt. The page to which it had been opened was marked faintly by the pressure of a finger, and the poem upon that page was Vitae Lampada. Play up, and play the game," murmured Sergeant Hurst involuntarily. Slack looked at him. Hurst reddened. "Sorry, sir, I had to learn it at school." "Everybody," said Slack, "had to learn it at school." He put the book down. Then, because he was a conscientious man beneath the irritability, he picked it up again and slipped it into an evidence bag. "The desk," he said. "Show me the desk." The desk, Mrs. Gudgeon said, had not been touched. Its top was tidy, a blotter, an inkstand, a photograph of a young woman in Edwardian white, the late Mrs. Fenwick, dead these 20 years, and a small locked drawer in the left-hand pedestal. Slack tried the drawer. It was locked. The key was not on the desk, nor on the ring in the Colonel's dressing-gown pocket, nor, as it presently transpired, anywhere in the house. "Curious," said Slack. "Very curious, sir," said Sergeant Hurst. They went down to the village at 8. At the Blue Boar, Mr. Denning was on his third whisky and third cigarette in the corner by the window, with the look of a man waiting for a train that would not come. He looked up sharply as the two policemen entered, and then, with a visible effort, looked down again. Slack ordered a lemonade because he was on duty and installed himself 2 tables away. "Mr. Denning," he said courteously, "a word when you have finished, sir." "I have finished," said Denning, and pushed the glass away. They spoke, at Denning's suggestion, in the small back parlour where the landlord kept his accounts. Denning sat down heavily. He was, Slack observed, in worse condition than at breakfast, the black tie awry, a smear of something on one cuff, the eyes a little too bright. "You saw your uncle yesterday evening," said Slack. "I dined with him. I left at 9. You left him well?" "I left him," said Denning, and paused. "I left him alive." Slack let the pause do its work. Then he said, "Was there a quarrel, sir?" Denning laughed, a short, mirthless sound. "With my uncle, Inspector, there was never a quarrel. There was, from time to time, a lecture. Last night was a lecture." "On what subject?" "On my general disposition, my debts, my unsuitability as a nephew, the usual programme." He shrugged. "He told me he was altering his will." "In your favour?" "Away from it, Inspector. Not entirely, but a good deal away from it." "In whose favour then, sir?" Denning looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, quite steadily, "He did not tell me. He said only that there was, as he put it, an old obligation. He said the word twice, obligation. Then he asked me to leave." Slack wrote this down. Denning watched him write. When Slack had done, Denning added without being asked, "For what it is worth, Inspector, I did not kill him. I went from Marchbanks to the Blue Boar, from the Blue Boar to my room, and from my room to sleep. I did not do it well, but I did it." On his way home, Miss Marple, who had gone out ostensibly to lock up her henhouse and in reality to see what the village was doing, met Mr. Denning at the churchyard gate. He was standing quite still, hat in hand, looking down at the Lychgate step. Upon the step someone had, that afternoon, laid a third bunch of white roses. This time the ribbon was not black but plain white, and this time Miss Marple saw it as clearly as he did. The roses had had their thorns removed. Denning did not see her at first. He was staring at the roses with an expression she could not for a moment read. Then he saw her, and put on his hat and said, in a voice not entirely steady, "Miss Marple, do you happen to know who leaves those?" "I do not," said Miss Marple truthfully. "I have been wondering. They have been left before?" "3 times to my knowledge. This is the third." He was silent. Then he said, more to the roses than to her, "My uncle used to say that a rose without thorns was a very sad thing. He said it was, a rose that had been forgiven too soon." He turned to her. "Good evening, Miss Marple. I beg your pardon." He walked away up the lane. Miss Marple looked after him, and then, for some time, at the roses. At last she reached down, and without disturbing them, ran her thumb very lightly along one of the stems. Not a thorn. Not one. Somebody had gone over the whole bunch patiently with a small, sharp knife. She went home in the dusk. In the study of Marchbanks at that same moment, Inspector Slack was writing, in the neat hand he used for such occasions, the words 1. The glass, washed. 2. The drawer, locked, key missing. 3. Old obligation. 4. New bolt. Section 4. An obvious young man. The word Newbolt was still upon Inspector Slack's blotter when, at 9 the next morning, he arrested Mr. Anthony Denning on suspicion of the wilful murder of his uncle. He did not use those words. He used, instead, the more elastic phrase, "I must ask you, sir, to come with us to Much Benham for further questioning," which in Inspector Slack's mouth had, over the years, done duty for every gradation of official displeasure, from a caution about a bicycle lamp to a charge of manslaughter. Mr. Denning came with him. He came without protest, without his hat, and without, Mrs. Gudgeon reported tearfully that afternoon, any breakfast. The village received the news with the mixture of satisfaction and dismay it reserved for events which confirmed both its worst suspicions and its best gossip. At the post office, Mrs. Hartnell said she had known it from the first. The boy had a look. At the War Memorial, Miss Weatherby said she had said, as long ago as Easter, that no good would come of Colonel Fenwick's nephew. He wore, she said, the wrong kind of shoes. Only at the vicarage did Griselda Clement refuse to join the chorus. "It cannot be him, Jane," she said. "It cannot. He looks like a boy who has lost his dog." "That," said Miss Marple quietly, "is very often the appearance of a young man who has done something he cannot undo. It is also very often the appearance of a young man who has been done to." They were sitting in the vicarage garden. It was the 3rd day, and the June air had thickened. There was thunder somewhere behind the downs. Griselda's terrier, Beauty, had settled with an air of grievance beneath the tea-table, where she was as close to the cake plate as decency permitted. "But the evidence, Jane. What is the evidence, really? He quarrelled, well, he was lectured. He was to be cut out of the will. He was drunk. He came home late. That is not, surely that is not enough." "For Inspector Slack," said Miss Marple, "it is enough because it is convenient. That is not the same as its being enough." "Then who—" "That, dear, is a question that we are not yet ready to ask. We are still learning how to hear the answer." Griselda, who had learnt over 3 years of marriage to a country vicar how to interpret Miss Marple's grammar, held her peace and poured out more tea. Beauty sighed. Somewhere beyond the yew hedge, a lawn-mower began, and stopped, and began again. "There is one thing," said Miss Marple presently, "that has been troubling me since yesterday. It is the little scrap of paper in Colonel Fenwick's pocket. Remember, it is it not, a very definite word. Not please, or forgive, or come. Remember, it is the word one uses when one is quite certain that the other person has already spent a great deal of energy in not remembering." "You mean—" "I mean that whoever wrote it knew the Colonel was in the habit of forgetting a particular thing, and that they had at last decided that he should not be permitted to forget it any longer." Griselda considered this. But what, Jane? What was he to remember? A woman's voice at 10:15. New bolt open at Vitae Lampada. A locked drawer whose key has walked off. Roses at the lich gate with the thorns cut off. An old obligation. Miss Marple ticked them off on her fingers, gently, as though counting stitches. They are all speaking the same sentence, dear, but we have not yet found the grammar. At 4:30, Miss Marple set out, ostensibly to return a book of sermons to Miss Weatherby, and in fact to pass by Little Gables. She did not intend to call, she intended only to look. Little Gables was a small brick house behind a laurel hedge, and Mrs. Lestrange had, in the 18 months of her tenancy, permitted no one further than the front step. As Miss Marple approached, however, the garden gate opened, and Mrs. Lestrange herself came out. She was, again, in grey. Her veil was thrown back. Without it, her face, pale, unpainted and grave, had a beauty which, Miss Marple thought, was very nearly a punishment, the kind of beauty which had been used, once, for a purpose, and had thereafter been kept only out of habit. "Miss Marple," said Mrs. Lestrange. Her voice was low. It was, Miss Marple observed with a faint, cold interest, quite distinct, quite easily distinct, from any voice a housekeeper who saw her only at a distance would recognise. "Mrs. Lestrange, you are on your way somewhere." "I am on my way to Miss Weatherby's." "I do not think," said Mrs. Lestrange, "that you are. I think you are on your way past my gate. You may as well come in." It was not an invitation, it was an acknowledgement. Miss Marple went in. The drawing-room of Little Gables was almost bare. There were books and a piano, and a small watercolour of a headland Miss Marple did not recognise. On the mantelpiece stood a single photograph in a silver frame, a girl of perhaps 19, laughing in tennis whites, with a young man in the background whose face had been very carefully cut out of the picture. Where the young man's face had been, the cardboard showed through. "You wonder why I have asked you in," said Mrs. Lestrange when they were seated. "I wonder," said Miss Marple, "a great many things." "Then let me answer one of them. I did not visit Colonel Fenwick on the night he died." "I have not," said Miss Marple mildly, "suggested that you did." "You have not. Others will. I prefer, when I can, to answer questions before they are asked." "That is a habit," said Miss Marple, "which I have observed in my long life, chiefly in two sorts of people, those who have nothing to conceal, and those who have a great deal." Mrs. Lestrange smiled. It was the first smile Miss Marple had seen on her face, and it was not, entirely, a pleasant one. "You are said," she said, "to be a shrewd old lady." "I am," said Miss Marple, "an old lady who has lived a long time in a small place. That is the same thing, or very nearly." There was a pause. Somewhere in the house a clock struck the quarter. Mrs. Lestrange put her hands together in her lap. "I knew Ambrose Fenwick," she said at last, "a very long time ago. I had not seen him for 31 years until I came to St. Mary Mead. I did not come here because he was here. I came here because I wished to be forgotten. When I discovered, some months after my arrival, that he was living within a mile of my front door, I made a decision which I have kept. I did not speak to him. I did not write to him. I did not go near his house. And I did not go near his house on the night he died." "I believe you," said Miss Marple, and was surprised, faintly, to hear that she did. "You are the only person in this village," said Mrs. Lestrange, "of whom that is likely to be true." She rose. The interview was over. At the door, however, she paused. "Miss Marple, the young man they have arrested, Denning." "Yes. He did not, you understand me. He is not the sort. He has not the necessary coldness." "No," said Miss Marple thoughtfully. "He has not the necessary coldness. I had begun to think so myself." She went home the long way, past the churchyard. At the lich gate there were no roses today, but upon the step, quite deliberately, someone had laid a single thorn, snapped from its stem, its point turned upward. She stood a long time looking at it. Then, as the thunder muttered again behind the downs, she went home to her canary
her needlework, and the slow, patient assembling of what she already, in her mind, had begun to call the sentence. Section 5. The Thorn upon the Step. The thorn on the Lychgate step lay where Miss Marple had left it. She did not touch it.
She stood in the drizzle, the thunder having at last dispensed itself into a fine, apologetic rain, and considered it as a botanist considers a specimen he has been sent from very far away. The thorn was long, slightly curved, and at the base faintly stained. Not with blood, she thought, with something older and drier than blood. She was still considering it when the vicar came out of the church. Leonard Clement, in his 53rd year, was a mild, tall man whose chief distinction, in the eyes of his parish, was that he had, some years ago, made an exceptionally imprudent second marriage to a woman half his age, and whose chief distinction, in Miss Marple's private estimation, was that the marriage was proving both happy and, on Griselda's part, unexpectedly serious. "Jane," he said, "you are getting wet." "I am considering," said Miss Marple, "a thorn." He came and stood beside her. He looked at the thorn without pretending not to see it. That, she thought, was one of the virtues of a country clergyman he had learnt at last, not to pretend not to see. "There have been the roses," he said. "Griselda told me." "Yes." "Do you know, Jane, I nearly told the police about them, and then I did not. It seemed such a small thing and so easily misunderstood." "Everything at present is easily misunderstood, Leonard. What is it that you did not tell the police?" He hesitated. Then, with the reluctance of a man who has decided that the truth is now, at last, cheaper than the concealment of it, he said, "About 4 months ago, in February it must have been, Colonel Fenwick came to see me. Not on parish business. He came, he said, to inquire about the possibility of a private confession." Miss Marple was silent. "You know we do not, in this parish, make a great deal of that. But he was serious. He was frightened, Jane. He was not a man who was easily frightened. I had known him 7 years, and I had never seen it. He said in a very quiet voice that he had done something a long time ago for which he had never accounted, and that lately he had come to feel that it was, those were his words, walking after him." "Walking after him," repeated Miss Marple. "I told him what one is bound to tell, that the mercy of God is not conditional upon the vicar of St. Mary Mead, that if he wished to speak, he might speak, that if he wished to speak only to heaven, heaven would suffice. He thanked me and said he would think of it. He did not come back, and I did not afterwards press him." "Did he say," asked Miss Marple, "of what nature the thing was?" "He said only, and Jane, I have thought of this often since, he said only that it concerned a young woman, that was all. He did not say her name, he did not say she was living, he did not say she was dead." The rain thickened. Miss Marple opened her umbrella. Under it, side by side, they stood a while longer above the small, patient thorn. "Leonard," she said at last, "I should like you to do something for me. I should like you to look in the parish records for a burial in, I think it will be 1907 or 1908, of a young woman under 25, not necessarily under the name of Fenwick, under any name, but a young woman. That is a large search." "It is," said Miss Marple gently, "a beginning." He nodded. He would do it, of course. He did, in the event, do it that very night, with an oil lamp and the great leather-bound volumes in the vestry, and he did not find what she had asked for, and it was, as she had already begun to suspect, precisely the not finding that was the clue. Miss Marple walked home slowly. The drizzle had, by the time she reached her gate, become a steady rain. Her umbrella dripped. Her stockings, she felt with resignation, were spotted. She went in, changed, and applied herself with a fresh pot of tea to the small notebook in which she kept, beside recipes, garden lists, and the birthdays of great nieces, such observations as concerned her present work. She wrote, "The Colonel, frightened, 4 months ago, something walking after him, a young woman, no burial in this parish. Mrs. Lestrange, 31 years absent, wishing to be forgotten, the nephew, an old obligation, the Newbolt, Vitae Lampada, play up, the schoolboy's poem, the locked drawer, key gone, the roses, thorns removed, except one, point upward." She looked at the list a long time. Then, beside the last item, she wrote, "A rose without thorns, a rose forgiven too soon," and beneath that, after a pause, "But somebody has kept a thorn." She set down her pen, the canary chirped, rain rattled the window, and Miss Marple, with the quiet, almost sorrowful care of one drawing a curtain in a sick room, closed the notebook and put it away. At 8:30, Griselda Clement arrived, out of breath and out of umbrella. "Jane," she said, "they have let Denning out." "Have they, dear?" "On bail. Mr. Petherick arranged it, and Jane, his fiancée, has come." "His fiancée?" "Miss Emily Carstairs. She came off the 6 o'clock train. She is at the Blue Boar. Jane, she is quite unlike what one would have expected. Very quiet, very grave. Not a girl at all, really. She must be quite 30. 30, repeated Miss Marple. Yes, that is very interesting. Is it? Everything, dear, is very interesting when we do not yet understand it. Tell me, the name Carstairs, is she a Carstairs of anywhere in particular? She said her people were from Northumberland. Northumberland, said Miss Marple softly. Griselda, who was not slow, said, You know something. I know, said Miss Marple, that Colonel Fenwick's regiment, before the service he did not name, was based in Northumberland, and I know that a great many things in England are arranged so that the person who ought to hear them shall not. When Griselda had gone, Miss Marple sat for a while longer with the notebook closed on her knee. She was thinking of the thorn upon the step, of a rose which had had all its thorns removed but one, and of somebody who, having taken away the pain from a bunch of flowers, had, quite deliberately, kept back a single sharp point and laid it upon a step so that the village should walk past it, day after day, and not know that they were being watched by a grief which had, at last, decided to be seen. She thought then of a very small thing which she had heard some months ago and paid no attention to. Mrs. Lestrange's boy at Little Gables, who came up every Wednesday from Much Benham with the groceries, had once been overheard by the postman to remark that his mistress kept, in the room she called her sewing room, and never used for sewing, a great many roses, in bowls, under glass, dried, and that upon the wall of that room there was a photograph of a girl in tennis whites, with the face of the young man in the background carefully cut out. The picture, Miss Marple was now quite sure, was the same picture she had seen upon the mantelpiece of Little Gables, but it had, since her visit, been moved, which meant, she thought, either that Mrs. Lestrange had wished her to see it, and then to see that it was no longer there, or that Mrs. Lestrange had, upon reflection, wished to place it where it could not, subsequently, be seen at all. Both possibilities interested her. Neither, she thought, exhausted the matter. The rain stopped at 10. Miss Marple, who very rarely went out after dark, went out. She walked, without hurry, up the lane to Marchbanks. She did not go in. She stood at the edge of the drive and watched the copper beeches drip. A light burned in the study window. A shadow passed once behind the curtain and did not return. She looked long at the terrace steps, which she could just make out beyond the shrubbery. Then, with the same unhurried step, she went home. On her way back, at the corner where Old Pasture Lane met the churchyard wall, she almost collided with a figure coming the other way in the dark. It was Mrs. Gudgeon. Mrs. Gudgeon started, gave a small cry, and put a hand to her throat. "Miss Marple, You were going to the vicarage, dear?" "I was going," said Mrs. Gudgeon, and her voice trembled, "to see the vicar." "Not," said Miss Marple very gently, "to see me?" There was a long pause. Then Mrs. Gudgeon said in a whisper, "I did not know, madam, that I could." "You can," said Miss Marple. "Come." They walked back to Danemead together, and Mrs. Gudgeon, seated by the fire with a glass of Miss Marple's cowslip wine in her hand, spoke for the first time in 7 years, of a thing she had, until that hour, kept. Section 6. Mrs. Gudgeon's Confession. Mrs. Gudgeon was 58. She had come to Marchbanks when the Colonel bought it, and had, before that, been 15 years housekeeper to his elder sister at Cheltenham. She was a woman of the useful, unremarkable kind, in whose presence the Colonel had spoken more freely than he had ever quite intended, precisely because he never quite noticed she was there. This was, Miss Marple reflected, a form of invisibility,
which had, in every generation, been the great secret weapon of good housekeepers and worse spies. "You must not think, madam," said Mrs. Gudgeon, when the wine had begun its work, "that I have withheld anything from Inspector Slack out of dishonesty. It was only that what I know is not the kind of thing one can tell to a gentleman in an office. It is only the kind of thing one can tell, well, beside a fire." "I understand," said Miss Marple.
7 years ago, said Mrs. Gudgeon, when we came here, the Colonel had a small metal box. He kept it in the locked drawer of his study desk. He did not, so far as I know, ever open it, but he checked, madam, that it was still there, every night before he locked up, every night, for 7 years. Every night. Yes, madam, it was the last thing he did before he came upstairs. I would hear the drawer, once, twice, the key turned, then his step in the passage. And on the night he died? Mrs. Gudgeon's hands closed on the glass. "On the night he died, madam, I did not hear the drawer." Miss Marple nodded, quite slowly. "I did not think," said Mrs. Gudgeon, "anything of it at the time. I thought, the Colonel has had a visitor, he has been upset, he has forgotten. I went to sleep. But since Inspector Slack said the drawer was locked and the key gone, I have thought of it every hour, madam. He did not check the drawer that night because he had already opened it. For the visitor. There was a silence, filled only by the fire and the small, contented ticking of Miss Marple's mantelpiece clock. "Mrs. Gudgeon," said Miss Marple at last, "there is another thing, is there not?" Mrs. Gudgeon lifted her eyes. They were red but steady. "There is, madam, and it is the thing that I have not slept well since. 3 days before the Colonel died, 3 days, madam, on the Saturday afternoon, I was dusting in the study. He was not at home, he had gone to Much Benham, and on his desk, in the middle of the blotter, there was a letter he had begun and not finished. I did not read it, madam. I only saw the first line in setting the inkstand straight. It began, 'My dear Anna,' that was all. I moved the blotter over it and went out." "My dear Anna," repeated Miss Marple. "Yes, madam, that is not any name we have in the village." "No, dear, it is not any name we have in the village." Mrs. Gudgeon set down the empty glass. "Have I done right, madam, in telling you?" "You have done," said Miss Marple, "exactly right." She saw Mrs. Gudgeon to the gate. The rain had stopped altogether. A thin, wet moon had come out. Miss Marple stood a moment in her doorway after the housekeeper had gone, listening to the drip of the eaves and the distant, half-hearted bark of a farm dog. Anna. A name not in the village. A name in a letter never finished. A drawer opened for a visitor. A voice not known. A rose without thorns. The following morning, Thursday, was the inquest. It was held in the parish room. It was, in Inspector Slack's phrase, formal. That is, it produced the verdict he had told the coroner it would produce, which was murder by person or persons unknown, with an intimation that inquiries were proceeding. Denning, on bail, sat at the back, in a suit that had been pressed too hastily. Miss Emily Carstairs sat beside him. Miss Marple, from the far side of the room, watched them both. Miss Carstairs was, as Griselda had said, at least 30. She had a grave, plain face, not without beauty, but a beauty that was, on this day, held in check as one might hold a horse on a short rein. She wore no jewellery except a locket at her throat. She sat quite still. When Denning at one point laid his hand on hers, she did not look at him. She simply, very slightly, tightened her fingers upon his own. After the verdict, Miss Marple went up to them. "Mr. Denning, Miss Carstairs." "Miss Marple," said Denning quickly. "May I present Miss Carstairs, my fiancée?" "How do you do?" said Miss Marple. She held out her hand. Miss Carstairs took it. Her hand was cold, and her grip firm and brief. "You have come from Northumberland, my dear?" "From Newcastle," said Miss Carstairs. Her voice was low. Miss Marple had, in the past 3 days, heard it described in her own imagination often enough to be certain, as their eyes met, that it was not the voice Mrs. Gudgeon had heard through the door. "Newcastle, yes, a fine city," Your father is in business there? My father is dead. My mother is dead. I have, said Miss Carstairs without emphasis, no family. I am sorry. You need not be. It is a very old sorrow. There was a small, sharp pause. In it, Miss Marple perceived, as she had perceived, over 60 years, in 100 small drawing rooms, that Miss Emily Carstairs had said something she had not meant to say, and that Mr. Anthony Denning, standing beside her, had not quite understood what had been said. Miss Marple, said Denning, Emily and we are going up to Marchbanks this afternoon. There are arrangements. Would you care to walk up with us? That, said Miss Marple, would be very kind. They walked up at 4. The copper beeches whispered. Mrs. Gudgeon admitted them, and, at some sign from Denning, retired. In the study, the little green Newbolt still lay where Inspector Slack had put it back. Miss Marple, with a fond and elderly clumsiness, picked it up. Ah, she said, Newbolt. My father was very fond of Newbolt. Denning smiled a wan smile. My uncle too. Vitae lampada, said Miss Marple, opening the book at random, and then, very carefully, at the marked page. Play up, and play the game. Do you know, my dear, she turned to Miss Carstairs, I have often thought there is something a little cruel about that poem. It requires of the schoolboy that he play up not because he wishes to, but because he has been trained. It requires it, does it not, even of the man who has forgotten why he ever began the game at all? Miss Carstairs looked at her steadily. I do not know the poem, she said. I did not go to that kind of school. No, said Miss Marple gently. I did not think you had. Forgive me, my dear. It was only a foolish old woman's fancy. But she had watched Miss Carstairs' hand upon the back of the reading chair tighten upon the leather and quite slowly release it. And when, some minutes later, Denning left the room to fetch a paper from the library, Miss Marple, alone with Miss Carstairs, said without preamble, Anna is a very old-fashioned name. Miss Carstairs did not move, only her eyes changed. She said, It is my mother's name. Was, said Miss Marple softly. Was, said Miss Carstairs. Section 7. The Second Shock. Was, said Miss Carstairs, and her hand, without her permission, went to the locket at her throat. She did not open it. She only touched it, as one touches a thing that has stood a very long time in a place where one keeps the private accounts. Miss Marple did not press. There is, she knew, a moment in every such conversation when to push is to lose what has almost been given, and a moment, an instant later, when to be silent is to lose it altogether. She judged by the small tightening of Emily Carstairs' mouth that they were between these moments, and she waited. Denning came back with the paper before the balance tipped. He looked from one to the other, and, being a young man of no great subtlety, said, You have been talking of my uncle. Of poetry, said Miss Marple at once, and of Northumberland. Ah, he said, relieved. He had never, in his life, been afraid of poetry or Northumberland. He handed the paper, a folded sheet of blue notepaper, to Miss Marple. I found this in the library, on the shelf where he kept his regimental books. It fell out of the flyleaf of Colonel Buller's memoirs. I do not know if it is anything. Miss Marple unfolded the paper. It was a letter, dated the 8th of January of the current year, in a small, spidery hand. It read, Ambrose. She is coming south. She has written from the continent. I do not know what she means to do. I only know that she has, at last, decided it should not go on. If you have any influence with her, use it. If you have not, you will need, my dear Ambrose, the courage you had at Chitter. J. J, said Miss Marple. Chitter. Chitter, said Denning, was where my uncle was stationed. Before the war. Before the First War, I mean. Yes, said Miss Marple. She refolded the letter and gave it back. You will show this to Inspector Slack, dear boy. I meant to. But Miss Marple, his voice dropped. My uncle had no cousin, no brother, no friend called J. I have gone through his address book. There is no J. None the less, said Miss Marple, you will show it to him. They walked back to the village together at a little before 6. At the gate of Little Gables, Denning slowed. "Miss Marple," he said. "That woman, Mrs. Lestrange. Emily wishes to call." "Does she?" "Yes," said Miss Carstairs. It was the first word she had spoken since leaving the study. "I wish to." "Very well, dear," said Miss Marple. "Then I think you had better go alone." Emily Carstairs looked at her, and Miss Marple looked back. There passed between them in that instant a recognition which required no further words. Emily Carstairs turned in at the gate of Little Gables and walked without hesitation up the path. Miss Marple and Denning went on. "She is," said Denning after some paces, "a very strange girl." "She is," said Miss Marple, "a very unhappy one. How long have you been engaged, dear?" 11 weeks. "And you met her?" "In February, at a concert in Newcastle. I had gone up on my uncle's business, some matter of tenants. I was, you understand, Miss Marple, I was not in a good state. I had lost money. I had been foolish. She was kind. She said she had heard my name." "She had heard your name?" "So she said. She said her mother had known some Dennings long ago. She did not press it. But she was kind, Miss Marple. And in Newcastle that February, kindness was a thing I was very short of." Miss Marple said nothing. She was thinking that kindness, offered with that precision to that person at that moment, was one of the oldest and coldest weapons in the armoury of grief. At Danemead, she found Sergeant Hurst waiting on the doorstep. He had, he said, been sent by Inspector Slack. There had, he said, been a development. Would Miss Marple be so good as to accompany him at once to Marchbanks? "A development?" "Mrs. Gudgeon, ma'am. She is not dead, ma'am, thank God, but she has been struck. In the pantry, from behind, with, we think, the poker from the kitchen range." Miss Marple set down her basket. She said, quite calmly, "When?" "An hour ago, ma'am. She had been to the village, so cook says, in the morning, had come back after luncheon, had gone to lie down, had come down to the pantry at about 5:30. Cook found her at 5:45. Is she able to speak?" "Dr. Haydock says perhaps by tomorrow. She was, ma'am, saying one word, over and over, before she was quite unconscious." "What word?" "Anna, ma'am. She was saying, 'Anna, Anna, Anna.'" They went up to Marchbanks in the sergeant's small dark car. Miss Marple sat very still. She was thinking, not of Mrs. Gudgeon, but of the moment, the night before, when Mrs. Gudgeon had said the name at Danemead's fireside, and of who, in that quiet village, might have learned, in the intervening hours, that she had said it. Inspector Slack was standing in the pantry doorway, a man plainly furious with himself, with the village, and, as always at such moments, with Miss Marple, whom he had come, over the years, to regard as a species of weather. "Well, madam," he said without preamble, "you warned me, in your way." "I do not recall," said Miss Marple mildly, "having warned you at all, Inspector." "You warned me," said Slack, "by asking about the brandy glass, and I did not listen, because I had my man. And now my man was in the parish room at 4 o'clock, and at 6 o'clock the only witness to the voice at the door has been struck down. And my man is, I need not tell you, no longer my man." "No," said Miss Marple, "he is not." She went with Slack into the pantry. Mrs. Gudgeon had been carried up to her bed. On the flagged floor there was a small, dark, drying pool. Beside it, upon the flags, lay a single dried rose, brown, brittle, the petals half crumbled, as though it had been carried in a pocket for a very long time, and at the last dropped in haste. Slack pointed at it. "That was not there this morning, cook is certain." "No," said Miss Marple, "it was not." She stooped and looked at the rose without touching it. It was, she saw, a rose without thorns. Every thorn had been cleaned from the stem, except, she looked more closely, and her breath came out very slowly, except one, at the very base of the stem, snapped and pointing upward. "Inspector," she said, "may I ask you one thing? At 5:30 this afternoon, where were the following persons? Miss Emily Carstairs, Mr. Anthony Denning, Mrs. Lestrange, and, forgive me, the Reverend Leonard Clement." Slack, who had learnt, over the years, to accept Miss Marple's questions in the order she gave them, wrote the 4 names on a page of his notebook. "I shall find out," he said, "by nightfall." "Nightfall," said Miss Marple, "will do very well." On her way home, she stopped again at the lich gate. The step was bare, no rose, no thorn, only, upon the mossed stone, a small damp mark, where something had recently lain and been taken away. The village clock struck 7. The wood pigeon called, and this time, quite distinctly, was not answered. At Danemead, she found her canary asleep, her fire made up, and a note pushed under the door. The note was in a hand she did not know. It was on plain paper. It said, in 6 words, "He was not the only one." There was no signature. Miss Marple read the note twice. Then, with a hand that trembled very slightly, for she was, after all, an old woman, and it had been a very long day, she folded it into her notebook, beside the list of everything the village had not yet said aloud. Section 8. The Snare. The note lay in Miss Marple's notebook all night. It was still there in the morning, when the first thin sun struck the window-sill, and the canary, who had a punctual and unsentimental soul, began to sing. Miss Marple, who had slept less than she would admit, sat up in bed, opened the notebook, and read the 6 words once more. He was not the only one. There were, she reflected, only 2 ways in which such a sentence could be meant. It could mean, Colonel Fenwick was not the only man who did the thing for which he has died. Or it could mean, Colonel Fenwick is not the only man who will die for it. She was inclined, on balance, to think that the writer had meant both. At 9:30 she was in the vicarage garden. The vicar, upon her request of the night before, had spent the small hours in the vestry. He came out to her now with the air of a man who has, in his 53rd year, found something he was not sure he wished to find.
"Jane," he said, "you were right. There is no burial in this parish, at that period, of any young woman who could have been what you described, not under any name. But, Leonard, but, he said, there is a curious entry in the marriage register, in November 1907, between Ambrose Henry Fenwick, of the East Northumberlands, and Anna Elizabeth Carstairs, of Alnwick." Miss Marple sat down upon the vicarage bench. "Married," she said. "Married. In this church, Jane, by the Reverend Josiah Clement, my great-uncle, who was vicar here for 41 years. There is no entry of any subsequent death, no annulment, no divorce, in any register I can find." "He was a widower," said Miss Marple, slowly. "When he came to Marchbanks, he was a widower. His late wife was Mildred. There is her photograph on the desk." "Mildred," said the vicar. "Yes, Mildred Fenwick, née Warrender, married to him in London in 1912. 1912, said Miss Marple. They looked at one another. The mathematics did not require a great effort. 5 years. 5 years between an Anna and a Mildred, in which some perfectly usual thing must have happened, and had, evidently, not. "He was," said Miss Marple, "a bigamist." "He was," said the vicar, quietly, "either a bigamist, or a widower, or a divorced man. And there is no record of the last 2. But Jane, this is more than 50 years ago, and whatever it was, in the eye of the law, my great-uncle's business, and it is now no one's." "It is," said Miss Marple, "the business of Anna Elizabeth Carstairs." "If she lived." "If she lived," said Miss Marple, "and if she did not, of her daughter." The vicar was silent. In the border, a bee moved from campanula to campanula, in the same manner as a clergyman making pastoral visits. "You do not," said the vicar at last, "mean—" "I mean," said Miss Marple, "that a young woman of about 30 has come to St. Mary Mead upon the arm of Colonel Fenwick's nephew, whom she met by kindness in a strange city,
and that her name is Carstairs, and that her mother's name was Anna, and that her mother is dead. That is all, at present, that I mean. And Mrs. Lestrange? Mrs. Lestrange, said Miss Marple, is another matter, and I am going this morning to attend to it. She did not, however, go directly to Little Gables. She went first to the Blue Boar. Miss Emily Carstairs was, the landlady said, in the small sitting-room writing letters. Miss Marple sent up her card and was admitted. Miss Carstairs stood at the window. She turned when Miss Marple came in. She had, Miss Marple noted, been crying quite recently and with great restraint, so that only the whites of her eyes betrayed it. Miss Marple, my dear, said Miss Marple, sitting down without invitation and untying her bonnet strings as though she meant to stay some time. I have come to talk to you about roses. Miss Carstairs did not move. I have wondered, said Miss Marple, for some days at the person who has been leaving white roses at the lich gate. There have been 4 bunches, each with the thorns removed, except one thorn kept back and laid apart. It seemed to me that whoever left them was making, for herself and for one other person, a private communication, and that she had come, since the death of Colonel Fenwick, very close to the village, very close indeed, without permitting herself yet to be seen. I did not, until yesterday, know who she was. Emily Carstairs's hand went again to the locket at her throat. May I, said Miss Marple very gently, see it, my dear? There was a long, long pause. Then, very slowly, Emily Carstairs opened the locket. She held it out. Inside were 2 small photographs. On one side, a young woman, dark, grave, in the fashion of before the First War. On the other, a small child, perhaps 4 years old, upon the same young woman's knee. Your mother, said Miss Marple. My mother. And you. And me. Miss Marple looked at the photograph a long time. Then she said, she was not called Lestrange, was she? For a fraction of a second, Emily Carstairs did not understand. Then she understood, and her face, her plain, grave face, went white, and then, as slowly, red. Mrs. Lestrange, said Miss Marple, is not your mother. No, said Emily Carstairs. She closed the locket. Her voice, when it came, was quite steady and quite cold. My mother has been dead 19 years. Yes, said Miss Marple. I thought so. Forgive me, dear. I had to be sure. She said no more. She rose, tied her bonnet strings, and went to the door. There she paused, and without turning said, Miss Carstairs, the thorn upon the step, the one thorn you kept. Was it because you had at last decided that somebody in this village was to feel it? Behind her, Emily Carstairs said, very quietly, yes. Colonel Fenwick? Not only, not chiefly. Who chiefly, my dear? There was no answer. Miss Marple, after a moment, went out. On the landing she paused and closed her eyes, and for perhaps 10 seconds stood so, one hand on the banister, as an old woman does who has at last seen the whole of a thing at which she has been looking for a long time from one side only. When she went out into the street, she did not go to Little Gables. She went home, put on her second-best hat, took out her small notebook and wrote, beneath everything she had written before, not only, not chiefly. Then, after a moment, she added, J. At 2:30, Inspector Slack arrived. He had, he said, obtained the 4 whereabouts. At 5:30 on the previous afternoon, Miss Emily Carstairs had been at the Blue Boar. Mr. Anthony Denning had been at the parish room, discussing bail. Mrs. Lestrange had been in her garden, the maid had seen her at the pump, and the Reverend Leonard Clement had been in the vestry, alone. Alone, said Miss Marple. Alone, said Inspector Slack. He says he was reading the parish records. He was, said Miss Marple, reading the parish records. Section 9. The grammar of the sentence. He was, said Miss Marple, reading the parish records, and Inspector Slack, who had come expecting an answer, found himself instead in receipt of a repetition. He considered it as one considers a bill one has already paid. You mean, madam, that he was where he said he was? I mean, said Miss Marple,
that he was where he said he was, and that he was reading precisely what I asked him last night to read, namely, the marriage register for November 1907. And? And he found, said Miss Marple quietly, the marriage of Colonel Ambrose Fenwick to Anna Elizabeth Carstairs, solemnised in this church, never dissolved. Inspector Slack, whose face had the mottled complexion of a man who has, once again, been overtaken from behind by an old lady in a lavender cardigan, sat down without asking. "Bigamy," he said. "Bigamy," said Miss Marple, "or, at any rate, the appearance of it. But that, Inspector, is only the first line.
It is not yet the sentence." "Then, madam," said Slack, with a resigned civility which, 6 years ago, he would have thought himself incapable of extending to anyone under Chief Constable, "perhaps you had better give me the sentence." "Not yet, Inspector. I have not yet quite heard it myself. But I should be very grateful for 2 things. First, that you should telephone to Somerset House and inquire whether Anna Elizabeth Fenwick, née Carstairs, is registered as deceased between 1907 and, say, 1912. Second, that you should have the goodness to invite, this evening at 8, to the vicarage drawing-room, the following persons: Mr. Anthony Denning, Miss Emily Carstairs, Mrs. Lestrange, and Dr. Haydock." "Only those?" "Only those, and the vicar, of course, and yourself. It will be, as they say in the newspapers, a small gathering." Inspector Slack rose. At the door he paused. "Madam," he said, "I do not know how you know what you know. I have never known how. But I have learned that when you name persons, you name all the persons that will be required. There will be no need for any others?" "There will be no need," said Miss Marple gently, "for any others." When he was gone, she sat a long while by the window. The June afternoon had come out warm and bright. The light lay along the garden path in the honeyed slant it always took at 4. The canary sang. She thought not of any single person, but of the pattern the persons made, of who had spoken and who had not, of who had known the name Anna and who had not been supposed to know it, of the difference between grief and vengeance, and the still finer difference between vengeance and justice, and of the very great difference, above all, between a woman who has been wronged and a woman who has been used. At 4:30 she rose, took her second-best hat, and went, at last, to Little Gables. Mrs. Lestrange admitted her herself. "I have been expecting you," she said. "Yes," said Miss Marple. "I thought you had." They sat in the drawing-room. The silver frame on the mantelpiece was still empty. No, not empty. The picture had been returned. The girl in tennis whites laughed as before. The young man's face was still cut out. But there was, upon the wall behind, a new thing, a small, framed piece of paper, black-edged, a funeral card. "May I look?" said Miss Marple. "You may." She rose and read it. "In memory of Anna Elizabeth Fenwick, beloved wife of Ambrose, died 14th December 1908, in her 23rd year, in Christ's peace." "You have had this in your possession," said Miss Marple, without turning. "A long time." 19 years. You were, her sister." Mrs. Lestrange, in her armchair, was quite still. "I was her sister," she said. "Julia. She was Anna. I was 5 years older. Our mother died when Anna was 14. Our father, a difficult man, a year later. I brought her up. When she was 20, she went, against my wishes, to a subaltern's ball in Alnwick. She met Ambrose Fenwick. She was married to him, without our people's knowledge, in the November of 1907, in this church, on a weekend's leave. She was very much in love. She wrote to me. She said she was happy. She was, for 11 months, happy. In December 1908, she died. Of what, in those days, one wrote in a letter as a chill, and of what, in fact, was neglect and shame, and, I have always believed, a broken heart. Ambrose Fenwick had, by then, decided that a marriage contracted in that way was,
inconvenient. He had for some months been telling her that it was, in his phrase, no marriage at all. He deserted her. He deserted her. He arranged through friends that she should be received in a lodging in Alnwick. She died there, alone. Her child, she was expecting a child, died with her. Miss Marple sat down. The June light fell across the small watercolour of the headland, and Miss Marple, who had lived a long time, understood now that the headland was a headland in Northumberland, and that the small dark shape upon it was a woman, and that the woman was Anna. "You wrote to him," said Miss Marple, "in January of this year." "I wrote to him. I signed only J. I wrote to him after I understood what was to happen." "What was to happen?" "That my niece," said Julia Lestrange, "had come south. My niece, Anna's child." Miss Marple did not move. "Anna's child," she said very quietly, "died with her." "So I believed. So I was told. So I was allowed for 30 years to believe. In November of last year, I received a letter from a woman in Newcastle who had been the midwife at Anna's confinement and who was dying, and wished, before she died, to be relieved of a thing she had done. Anna's child had not died. The child had been living. She had been given, upon Anna's death, for a sum of money to a couple in Newcastle called Carstairs, who wished a daughter and had none, and who understood that the mother had been unmarried and had asked only that the child should never be told. The child was Emily. She had grown up believing herself the natural daughter of Mr. and Mrs. James Carstairs. She had grown up not knowing her mother's name, still less her father's. She had grown up an orphan, twice. "You wrote to her." "I wrote to her. I did not tell her yet that Ambrose Fenwick was living. I told her only that I was her aunt, and that she should come to me when she wished." She wrote back. She said she wished first to make some arrangements. In January she wrote to me from London that she was engaged to be married to Mr. Anthony Denning of St. Mary Mead. That was the day I sat down and wrote to Ambrose. I have not written to him since. I have not seen him since 1908. I have not, I ought to say, seen my niece either, except at the inquest yesterday, when we sat 6 pews apart and did not look at one another. Because, said Julia Lestrange, and her voice at last shook. She does not know that I am her aunt. I did not sign my letters. She wrote to a post office box in Much Benham. I told her only that a friend of her mother's would come to her at the proper time. I have not been able to bring myself. I do not know, Miss Marple, whether Emily has come south to be happy or to be revenged, and I have been very much afraid that if she had chosen the second and knew that I was here, she would ask me for my help. "And you would give it?" said Miss Marple. There was a long silence. "I would," said Julia Lestrange, "give it." Miss Marple rose. She was, on a sudden, extremely tired. "Mrs. Lestrange," she said, "you will come to the vicarage this evening at 8. "I will come." "And you will bring," said Miss Marple, "the funeral card." She went home the long way, past the churchyard. At the lych gate, upon the step, there lay, for the last time, a single white rose. All its thorns had been removed, every one. Miss Marple stood a long time before it. Then, with the slow, careful gesture of a woman closing a book she has read to the end, she reached down and picked it up. It weighed almost nothing. Section 10. The Vicarage Drawing Room. The rose still weighed almost nothing in Miss Marple's hand when, at 10 minutes to 8, she came in at the vicarage garden gate. She had not, in the intervening 3 hours, put it down. She had carried it home and set it in a small glass of water on the mantelpiece, and now she had brought it, in its glass, to the vicarage, and she set it upon the little table between the 2 windows of the drawing-room, where the last of the June sun could reach it. Nobody, coming in, remarked upon it. Nobody, in the end, would need to. They came in one by one. The vicar first, in his cassock, with the marriage register under his arm. Dr. Haydock next,
whose eyebrows, upon seeing the register, rose, but who said nothing. Inspector Slack and Sergeant Hurst, together and quiet. Then Anthony Denning and Emily Carstairs, arriving together but taking chairs on opposite sides of the room, so that between them lay the whole small space of the drawing-room, and neither looked at the other. Last, at 8:03, Julia Lestrange, in grey, her veil put back, the black-edged funeral card in her gloved hand. Griselda Clement, in the hall, closed the door softly and slipped away. Miss Marple sat in the armchair by the fireplace. There was no fire, only, upon the hearth, a small bowl of white roses which Griselda had put there in the morning and forgotten to remove. The new bolt lay upon Miss Marple's knee. "Thank you all," she said, "for coming. I shall try to be brief. I shall not, however, be quick, because the story is 50 years old, and it will not be hurried." She opened the new bolt. "Colonel Ambrose Fenwick," she said, "was a bigamist. In 1907 he married, in this church, a girl of 20 called Anna Carstairs. In 1908 she died alone in a lodging in Alnwick, believing herself deserted, expecting his child. He did not, so far as the parish knew, ever return to Northumberland. In 1912 he married, in London, Mildred Warrender, who died in 1938, without ever knowing that her marriage had been no marriage. In 1948 he retired here, a widower without a stain upon him, and became a decent and, in the small ways, a generous man. He loved his roses. He was kind to his housekeeper. He read Newbolt. Every night for 7 years he unlocked a drawer in his desk and looked at a small metal box. He never opened it. He never, I think, quite dared. What was in the box, we shall know in a moment, but we may guess already. Certain letters from Anna, certain papers, and the ring, for I do not think, ladies and gentlemen, that he ever brought himself to destroy the ring. Emily Carstairs' hands were folded very tight in her lap. For 30 years, said Miss Marple, he was permitted to forget. He forgot, as we all forget. He forgot as a schoolboy forgets. Play up, and play the game. One plays the next game, and the next. And one does not, if one can help it, think of the game before. But in the November of last year, a midwife in Newcastle, dying, sent a letter to a Miss Julia Carstairs, whom she had never met, and told her that her sister Anna's child had not died with her. That child was Emily. Emily had been sold, for a sum of money, to a couple who had wanted a daughter. Emily grew up an orphan. She did not know her mother's name. She did not know her father's. She grew up, indeed, in ignorance of everything except a great, dark, general grief which she took, as such children do, to be a defect in herself. She did not look at Emily. She looked instead at the small glass upon the table between the windows. In February of this year, said Miss Marple, Emily Carstairs, having received her aunt's letter, went to a concert in Newcastle at which she knew Mr. Anthony Denning would be present. She had by then discovered how, I do not at present ask, that her father was Ambrose Fenwick of St. Mary Mead. She had discovered, too, that Ambrose Fenwick had a nephew and heir. She was kind to that nephew. She was, subsequently, engaged to him. She came in the fullness of time, south. She came for 2 reasons. The one she avowed was to be married. The one she did not avow was to be seen, at last, by the man who had never known she had been born. Denning had gone quite white. He looked at Emily. She did not look at him. On the evening of the 10th, said Miss Marple, Emily Carstairs went to Marchbanks. She rang at the study French windows at 10:15. She did not use the front door because she wished the housekeeper to know only that there had been a woman. She did not wish, yet, to be named. She sat with Ambrose Fenwick for 20 minutes. She told him, I imagine, quite simply, who she was. She showed him, I imagine, her mother's locket and the ring, if she had it, and the funeral card. She did not, I think, mean to kill him. She meant only, at last, to be recognised. Emily Carstairs' eyes had filled, silently, with tears. Ambrose Fenwick, said Miss Marple, did not recognise her. He denied her. He denied Anna. He said, I imagine, and I imagine correctly, for the housekeeper heard him quiet, in the way a man is quiet who has been struck, that there had never been such a marriage, that there had never been such a girl, that he could produce, if pressed, gentlemen of his old regiment who would swear that in November 1907 he was in India. He was, ladies and gentlemen, prepared to lie again. And he was prepared, this time, to lie to his own child. It was then, I think, that Emily Carstairs, who had come to be recognised, discovered that she had come, in fact, to be denied for the second time in her life, and that what her mother had suffered alone at 22, she was now to suffer alone at 30. Emily Carstairs's tears fell. She did not lift her hand to them. She left him, said Miss Marple, at a little after 11. She left him standing, alive, in the study. She did not touch him. She did not, I am quite certain, so much as raise her voice. She left by the front door, quietly, as any well-brought-up young woman leaves a house at night. And she went, did you not, my dear, back to the Blue Boar, and sat on her bed until it was light. Emily Carstairs, without looking up, nodded once. But, said Miss Marple, there was that night a second visitor. The room did not precisely move, but something in its air shifted. Colonel Fenwick, said Miss Marple, upon Emily's leaving, was, I think, for the first time in 50 years, entirely afraid. He had denied his daughter. He had denied Anna. He had at last, in the small hours of a June night, opened the drawer he had for 7 years only touched. He had taken out the box. He had, perhaps, read the letters. He was standing on the terrace, in his dressing gown, with the box unlocked and the papers on the little table, when the second visitor came up the terrace steps. She paused. The second visitor, said Miss Marple, knew Ambrose Fenwick's routines, knew that he checked the drawer every night, knew tonight that he had opened it, knew because she had been told that his daughter had come, because his daughter, on returning to the Blue Boar, had passed under Little Gables and had said to the woman at the gate only 3 words, "He denied me." Julia Lestrange put her gloved hands very slowly upon the black-edged card in her lap. She had waited 31 years, said Miss Marple gently, and she had promised herself she would never come near his house. She kept that promise until the moment her sister's daughter came to her gate and said, "He denied me." Then she took her sister's ring, the small, hard weight she had carried in her pocket, I imagine, for 19 years, and she went up to Marchbanks by the field path, and she came out onto the terrace behind him. She did not strike him. She did not need to. She spoke his name. He turned. He saw her, I think for the first time knowing who she was, and he took 1 step backwards, only 1. It was enough. The top step is worn on the right. He fell. His temple struck the stone. And she did not, did you, Julia, call for help? She stood a long time on the terrace, and she took from the little table 1 thing, and she went home by the field path in the dark. She left in his pocket a scrap of paper on which she had written, at Little Gables, hours before, the single word, "Remember." Julia Lestrange lifted her eyes. "Yes," she said very quietly. "Yes." "And the thing you took," said Miss Marple, "was the ring." Julia Lestrange opened her hand. In it, quite small, lay a plain gold band. "But," said Miss Marple, and here her voice altered, and every person in the room felt the alteration without knowing what it was. "But that is not the sentence either. That is only still the first 2 lines of it." They looked at her. "Because," said Miss Marple, "there was there not, a 3rd person on the terrace that night?" Nobody moved. "Mrs. Gudgeon," said Miss Marple, "heard the front door shut at 11:30. Emily left at 11. That is the first door. Julia, you left, I think, by the field path, without going through the house at all. So the door at 11:30 was neither of you. Somebody else was in the house that night when the Colonel fell. Somebody who then went out by the front door and closed it very softly and walked away down the drive. Somebody who, 3 days later, when Mrs. Gudgeon began in confusion to remember and to repeat the name Anna, went to the pantry at 5:30 and struck her from behind with the poker, and who dropped at her feet a dried rose kept, I think, for a very long time in the flyleaf of a book called The Poems of Sir Henry Newbolt.
which is not, I have ascertained, the Colonel's copy. The Colonel's copy is upstairs still, in his bedroom, quite unmarked. The copy which lay open on the study table on the morning of the 10th at Vitae Lampada belonged, ladies and gentlemen, to the second visitor's brother. There was a small, complete silence. Play up, and play the game," said Miss Marple, and her voice was suddenly, briefly, unbearable in its softness.
There was, in that regiment, in India, in 1907, a subaltern whom Ambrose Fenwick knew, a young man of 19, a young man who, when Anna Carstairs was left in Alnwick, was the friend to whom Ambrose confided that the marriage had been a mistake, and who was the friend that arranged, through further friends, the lodging in Alnwick where Anna died, who was, in short, the man who did the practical work of Ambrose Fenwick's cruelty. That young man came home in 1919, a major. He is now, in our own year, an old gentleman of 70, a widower, well thought of, punctual at church. He is the writer of the letter signed J. Every head slowly turned. J, said Miss Marple gently, was not Julia. J was a Christian name. Jocelyn. Dr. Jocelyn Haydock. Dr. Haydock, who had sat all this while with his hands upon his knees, did not move. Only, after a moment, his eyelids closed and opened again. He said, very quietly, "Yes, Jane." "You wrote to him," said Miss Marple, "in January, warning him she was coming south, not to save him, but because you had, for 50 years, been the only friend he had that knew. You went to Marchbanks that night. You went by the front door, because Ambrose had given you a key 30 years ago, and you had never returned it. You came up to the study. You found him upon the terrace, dead. You saw, I think, Julia, at the far end of the terrace, going away. You did not stop her. You went into the study, and you took from the little table one thing and put it into your pocket, and then went out by the front door and shut it softly. The thing you took, Jocelyn, was the letter you had written him in January, the letter signed J, because you could not, at your age, at your reputation, at your place in this village, permit it to be found. And 3 days later, when poor Gudgeon began to say Anna in her sleep, you went to the pantry at 5:30, and you did what had, of course, to be done. You dropped the rose because your hand shook. You had not, dear old friend, killed anyone before. Dr. Haydock said, still without moving, "No, Jane, I had not." He rose. He walked quite steadily to the table between the windows. He looked down a long moment at the single white rose in the glass. Then he turned to Inspector Slack. "Whenever you please, Inspector," he said. Miss Marple did not weep, but she closed the new bolt very gently upon her knee, and the room, for perhaps 10 seconds, was so quiet that they could all quite distinctly hear from beyond the vicarage garden the wood pigeon in the yew. Section 11. The Village After. The wood pigeon in the yew was still calling when Dr. Haydock walked out of the vicarage drawing-room with Inspector Slack at his elbow and Sergeant Hurst 2 paces behind. He did not, at the door, look back. He paused only once on the threshold of the hall to lay upon the little rosewood table there the small brass key which for 30 years had opened the front door of Marchbanks. And then he went out into the June dusk and down the vicarage path and away, as the village would later say, wonderingly of its old doctor, with his back as straight as it had been at 40. Behind him in the drawing-room, nobody moved for a long time. It was Julia Lestrange who, at last, rose. She crossed to the armchair by the empty fireplace, and she knelt, an old-fashioned motion, and, in that grey silk, an oddly girlish one, and she took Miss Marple's hand, and she pressed it to her cheek. She did not speak. Miss Marple, whose hand was old and rather cold, did not withdraw it. After a moment, Julia rose and turned and looked across the room at Emily Carstairs. Emily had, throughout the whole of the last 20 minutes, sat quite still. She now stood. The 2 women, the aunt of 55, the niece of 30, walked without any word at all to the middle of the room, and there they met, and Julia lifted her veil, and Emily, quite simply, put her arms about her. And Julia, who had not wept in 19 years, wept then upon her sister's daughter's shoulder, with the small, dry weeping of women who have been, for far too long, alone. Anthony Denning, when they had gone out together into the garden, was left standing in the middle of the drawing-room with his hands hanging. Miss Marple, from the armchair, looked at him kindly. "Sit down, my dear." He sat. He said, after a moment, "Emily." "Emily," said Miss Marple, "came south, dear boy, for 2 reasons. She did not, in the end, choose between them. She discovered, I think, that she could not choose between them, and I believe, though of that only she can tell you, that the second reason has, in these last weeks, been quite overtaken by a third which she did not intend, and which is you." Denning looked at the floor. He said, "Miss Marple, I have been a very great fool." "You have been," said Miss Marple, "young. It is not entirely the same thing. Give her time. Give yourself time. And, dear boy, do not, if you can possibly help it, become a man who is generous at the fete and kind to his housekeeper, and, in the small dark drawer of himself, quite unable to remember what he is." He got up. He kissed her hand, the first and, as it happened, the last time in his life he ever kissed any woman's hand at all, and he went out to find Emily in the garden. Miss Marple, alone at last with the vicar, sat a long while looking at the single white rose in the glass on the table between the windows. The last of the June sun had gone. Griselda came in with a lamp, set it down, and, seeing their 2 faces, went softly out again. "Jocelyn," said the vicar quietly. "Jocelyn," said Miss Marple. "You have known him how long?" 43 years. He set my mother's wrist, in the spring of 1912. He was, at that time, a young man newly back from India. He was, Leonard, a young man who had done, we now know, a wicked thing in Alnwick in December of 1908, and who had come to St. Mary Mead, I am now sure, chiefly because he had heard that Ambrose Fenwick, remarried and unpunished, was living an hour's train from London. He watched Ambrose. He watched him for 50 years. He did not, in all that time, say one word of reproach. He was, in every visible respect, Ambrose's kindest friend, and he was, in the drawer at the back of his mind, as Ambrose was in his own, waiting. For what, Jane? For the day the past would come south by train. He had always known it would. Men who have arranged such things always know. He wrote to Ambrose in January, warning him. He hoped, I do believe this, Leonard, that Ambrose, warned, would find some means to meet Anna's daughter honourably. When Ambrose, instead, denied her, Jocelyn did what he had been rehearsing in his heart for half a century. He came up to Marchbanks. He found Ambrose already dead and Julia already gone. He should, at that moment, have gone away and let the police work as they might. Instead, because he was 70 and tired and had spent 50 years being the man who tidied up after Ambrose Fenwick, he tidied. He took his letter. He shut the door. He went home. And 3 days later, when Mrs. Gudgeon was heard to murmur Anna in the parish room porch, he did the last and the worst of the tidyings. He did not mean to kill Mrs. Gudgeon. He did not. She will live. He is glad of that, and it is, at any rate, one small mercy for him to take with him. The vicar said after a silence, "Jane, what became of Ambrose's box?" "It is in the locked drawer, still. Inspector Slack will open it tomorrow. In it he will find, I believe, 3 letters from Anna, a photograph, a certificate of marriage, and a plain gold ring. Ambrose, you see, had never dared to destroy them. He had used, for 50 years, the courage he had at Chitter to do everything but the one thing that would have needed it. That is, dear Leonard, the commonest form courage takes in respectable men." She rose at last and put on her second-best hat. In the hall she paused. Upon the rosewood table lay the small brass key of Marchbanks, where Jocelyn Haydock had set it down. She looked at it, briefly, and did not touch it. She walked home in the last of the light. The Lichgate step was, this evening, empty. It would remain empty. There would be, from that night forward, No roses, no thorns, no ribbon. The small private conversation which had for 6 days been held there by grief was over. The village, St. Mary Mead, which had begun the week believing itself blameless, would, in the weeks to come, quite carefully repair itself. Mrs. Hartnell would resume her verdicts. Miss Weatherby would revise her theories. Mrs. Price Ridley would, in due course, take credit for having said all along that there was something not quite right about the doctor. The wood pigeon would call and be answered. At Danemead, the tabby cat was upon the wall. The canary was asleep. Miss Marple went in, closed her door, and stood a moment with her back to it. She was very tired. She was thinking, not of Ambrose Fenwick, whom she had never liked, nor of Jocelyn Haydock, whom she had loved a little as one loves the friend of one's mother's youth, but of a girl of 22 who had died alone in a lodging in Alnwick in December 1908, believing herself abandoned, and of the child that had been born and grown up and come south at last and been denied. She thought of the small phrase in the poem the old doctor's brother had marked, 50 years before, in a book kept behind others upon a shelf in Marchbanks. They saved his name. She had never, in her life, understood that line so well as she did that night. Half the wickedness she had ever met in her long, quiet life had been done, in the end, by decent men who were saving their names. She put the Newbolt upon her shelf. She fed the canary. She sat down at last in her armchair by the fire. On the mantelpiece, in a small blue jug, stood the single white rose she had brought home from the Lichgate that afternoon. It was quite thornless. She looked at it a long time. Then, with a movement so slight that even the tabby cat coming to sit upon her knee did not observe it, she nodded to it once, as an old woman nods, at last, to a story she has heard to the end, and closed her eyes. Outside, in the June dark, the wood pigeon called once, and this time, quite distinctly, from the copper beeches beyond the churchyard, was answered. The village slept. The roses of St. Mary Mead, blooming with an almost indecent brightness in the warm blackness of the summer night, kept, as roses do, their thorns tucked beneath the leaves, and would, in the morning, be admired by everybody who passed. The end.